Hello, everyone. Today we're going to have a taster lecture that deals with Africa in the 19th century, and specifically the relationship between Africa and Europe during that very tumultuous, transformative period in both continents' history. This taster lecture is designed to give you an idea of the kinds of things that you can explore on the history programme here at Oxford. We run a number of African history courses, and this is a little insight into some of the dynamics that we examine in the making of Africa's modern history. We're going to begin by using two particular characters. Henry Morton Stanley, who's a very prominent explorer of the Victorian era, and someone who is possibly not quite as well known, at least in the West, and that is Mutesa, who is king, or Kabaka in the local language, of the Kingdom of Uganda in East Africa, which was one of the most prominent states in the region. And really the story of their interaction can be used as a useful entry point into a larger understanding of the relationship between Africa and Europe in the 19th century. They both represent particular dynamics. They represent distinctive cultural and political phenomena that are unfolding across both continents. And the way that they interact is a useful way to begin to think about the relationship between Africa and Europe in the 19th century. When we think about these two characters, and they're up on the screen now, on the left, Stanley, on the right, Mutesa. When we think about them, I want us to think about what they represent in terms of an increasingly global 19th century. And by global, of course, we also mean an imperial century, a century of extraordinary economic interaction, as well as political turmoil. Henry Morton Stanley, again on the left here, photographed in a London photographic studio, probably around 1880, very much posing as the great conqueror of African exploration. And he's pictured here with his servant, Kalulu, who was a little boy he took back with him from East Africa. All explorers tended to represent themselves in this particular manner. And on the right, Kabaka Mutesa of Uganda. This is from a contemporary engraving. And Mutesa was very much seen as one of the great potentates of East Africa, at the head of a very hierarchical political system in one of the largest and most dynamic states in the region. And the two of them met in 1875. Stanley was on one of his dramatic expeditions across the region. In fact, it was part of an expedition that led him from the east coast to the west coast of the continent. And he made a detour up around the area of modern Uganda, and he met Mutesa. And he describes his interaction with Mutesa in a very prominent, very problematic text from the era, which he called Through the Dark Continent, popularizing the idea of Africa as precisely that, as a place of darkness, at least for Europeans. But the interaction between the two is very interesting. Stanley was deeply impressed by Mutesa. Mutesa talked to Stanley and demonstrated, in fact, the kingdom's military prowess. In fact, Stanley claims to have witnessed a military expedition from a hillside. They talked about their respective cultural worlds. They described the influences on one another's lives. Stanley talked about Christianity, of course. Claims to have introduced Mutesa to the Bible. And it was a very particular moment where the two met in many ways as equals, at least ostensibly. Stanley did have an armed entourage with him, but he was very much enjoying Mutesa's hospitality. And Mutesa, who had begun to welcome more and more foreign visitors to his kingdom, was very struck by what Stanley represented. And there was a very key moment in our understanding of late 19th century Africa when these two came together. Stanley later wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph of London, where he basically called on missionaries to come out to the kingdom and declared that Buganda was a real civilizing influence in the region, that if missionaries came to Buganda, they would find in Mutesa a very receptive, sagacious, far-sighted ruler. Buganda, in other words, was identified as fertile ground for what would become known as British and civilizing mission. On his part, Mutesa saw certain advantages in Stanley. He certainly saw the ability to acquire firearms, but also knowledge of the wider world, and was very keen to engage with the West in cultural and economic terms. This then was an era, as we see from this particular map, in which a commercial and a cultural frontier is advancing across East Africa. And this is really what Stanley represents in terms of his mobility. We see here a number of arrows moving in all sorts of directions, but the general thrust is, as you can see on this map, from the east coast across the region of what is now Tanzania, to some extent modern Kenya, and also down here northern Mozambique. This was a commercial frontier that was emanating from the east coast of Africa, particularly centered on Zanzibar, and responsible for the establishment of a number of key trading posts. This one here at Tabora was particularly important. Stanley followed this road all the way through central Tanzania, modern Tanzania, and then curled up round into what is now Uganda. And he followed the shoreline of Lake Victoria, which is an enormous inland body of water, the third largest in the world, in fact, and is really a small inland sea. And Buganda was the kingdom that he encountered up here, along the northern shore. Where the cursor is here, this is in fact the source of the Nile, which had long been the source of fascination for European explorers before Stanley. So when Stanley turns up in Buganda, he was more or less halfway through a journey which was momentous for Europe, for the world, and for Africa in many ways. And Buganda was attractive to a number of explorers and increasingly missionaries because it seemed to fascinate those Europeans who encountered it. It was one of the more dynamic, complex kingdoms in the region, and certainly struck various chords with a European audience. What was Buganda itself? Well, here it is. The map on the right, you can see this is the area of modern day Uganda. And as you might be able to work out already, Buganda, in fact, gave its name to the modern Republic of Uganda. The map on the left shows that Uganda is, in fact, the core of the modern state of Uganda. Buganda was a remarkable kingdom. It began life as a number of small clans clinging to the northern shore of Lake Victoria, and gradually expanded to encompass a sizable area relative to the wider region. Very fertile, highly militarized, very hierarchical. An anthropologist in the early 20th century estimated that possibly 1 in 10 Uganda men was a chief, which gives us some idea of how hierarchical it actually was, highly stratified society. And Buganda came to to be defined by this particular territory, but it also had influence across a much wider region, into the north of modern Uganda, and out west, as far as the Democratic Republic of Congo, modern day Congo, and it also imposed itself on Lake Victoria. So the kingdom itself drew people like Stanley to it. It was a dominant engine of change in the region. And there were various reasons for that. Buganda deeply impressed Europeans who visited the place. On the top left, you see a very famous picture from Stanley's own text. It was later reproduced in all sorts of other books from the period. But this is the classic view of the royal enclosure, the royal capital, up here on the top of Rubaga Hill, which is now the site of the Roman Catholic cathedral in Kampala, the capital of Uganda. And Europeans were struck by the extraordinary roads that Uganda people seemed capable of building. This deeply impressed Europeans, particularly British explorers who were very keen on roads and infrastructure. And we can see very well made, and on either side of the road itself, if you look closely, you can see little enclosures, little homesteads nestling among the trees around the royal enclosure. Lots of these settlements were basically small replications of the royal capital itself, which sat dominant up on the hill there. So this was the kind of image that impressed Stanley in the 1870s. Again, drawing Europeans up this road, believing that they could do business with Buganda, a kingdom like Buganda, and they could ultimately use Buganda for imperial purposes. Buganda felt much the same about foreign visitors. They felt that they could co-opt those foreign visitors, including people like Stanley. One of the reasons they believed that, you can see from the picture on the top right, is that Buganda was a highly militarized society, known for its martial prowess. This is again a contemporary representation of Uganda soldiers. Buganda's armies covered a very wide area, and the royal court itself was regarded as orderly, civilized in European terms. This again is a contemporary representation in Stanley's own text. This is Mutesa sitting in the foreground, and in the background a number of the prominent chiefs, dressed very much in the style of the coastal traders who had also begun to fan out across the region and who were also drawn to a kingdom like Buganda in search of slaves and ivory, the two major exports from the region. So Stanley arrives at a moment of real commercial flux, commercial change. Buganda is very much the driver of two commerces, trade, slaves and ivory, which do not actually have a long-term future, but which nonetheless reflected Buganda's own commercial ambition and aspiration. So Buganda is a real hub in the region, and that's why Stanley ended up there. But if we pan out a little, we can see that Buganda is not unique. Buganda, in fact, is rather small, as you can see here from this map from circa 18, representing Africa around 1880. In terms of the 19th century, Africa was undergoing something of a political and commercial transformation. This is a remarkable period in the continent's history, and this is the period before the partition, the conquest of Africa by Europe. And you can see from this colourful representation the various shapes and sizes of the states and societies which were beginning to emerge in 19th century Africa. Some of them relatively compact, like Uganda, Bunyoro over here, Karagwe, Burundi, a number of other smaller states in West Africa, Benin, Dahomey. Some of them are rather large, the Sokoto Caliphate, Lunda, Egypt's influence coming down the Nile into Sudan, and Ethiopia. This was a period of revolution in African history. And it was that revolution, it was those revolutionary dynamics that very much interacted with Europe's own imperial expansion. Some of the characters that represented these shifts in statehood, new economic systems, new cultures. King Shaka of the Zulu over here on the left. This is quite a famous representation of him from the 1820s. Mirambo, next in line here, major warlord in central Tanzania of the Nyamwezi people in the 1870s. Stanley also interacted with Mirambo. Mirambo also, like Shaka of the Zulu, known for his military genius, his ability to reform existing political systems, and he did so using an army of people like this fellow here. They were known as Ruga Ruga, which was a local term denoting a young unmarried soldier. Up here in the top right, Emperor Theodros of Ethiopia, again noted for his military genius, his capacity for political reform, and his economic ambition. And again, of course, Mutesa himself in the bottom right of the slide here. All of these kinds of figures represented new states or reformed versions of old states, new economic systems that were increasingly global in their ambition and in their engagement, new cultures, political cultures, aesthetic cultures, shifts in society. This is what these individuals represented. So Mutesa represents a particular revolutionary moment in African history. Stanley, for his part, represents the moment of Europe's new imperialism. Here he is, on the left, this is him here, famously greeting David Livingstone in 1871. David Livingstone had gone missing for a number of years in Central Africa. Livingstone was basically paid by the New York Herald to go and find him in one of the more famous explorations of the period. This is where he finally catches up with Livingstone in a place called Ujiji Kigoma on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. And Stanley represents a new kind of pioneering, aggressive exploration, which in many ways is the forerunner of European imperialism. And Stanley was a no-nonsense explorer, I think it's fair to say. He became known in the Lingala language in Congo as Bula Matari, the breaker of rocks. And he was indeed famous for his the violence that he inflicted often on Africans. So Stanley represents a particular moment in Europe's expansion, in Europe's interest in the world to the south, sub-Saharan Africa in particular. He is, of course, also representative of a period of heightened racism in Europe. Europe's own imperial expansion, beginning in the 1870s, the new imperialism of the late 19th century, is very much driven and in many ways justified by a heightened racialized view of the wider world. The image on the right shows Stanley, in fact, behind a machine gun. Again, a contemporary engraving. And it reminds us that although Stanley very much talked to Mutesa as an equal in the moment that they met in 1875, Stanley was nonetheless very well armed, and he represented a new and militarized, militant exploratory surge coming out of Europe. In the end, Europe's interest in Africa became increasingly violent, and again defined by a particular racial view of the continent. Hence the picture on the left, which is a very famous Punch magazine cartoon of John Bull, personification of England, of course, this time as the owner of an orphanage, required to take in yet another black baby, as the caption tells us. And this one is noted as being Uganda, which was the contemporary rendering of the Kingdom of Buganda. So Stanley again represents an imperial moment. And the imperial moment culminates, of course, in something rather more violent, rather more aggressive than Stanley's own expedition even would have suggested in the 1870s. It culminates in people like Cecil Rhodes, with whom Oxford, of course, has a complicated and in many ways problematic relationship. This again is a contemporary depiction of Rhodes straddling Africa from Cape to Cairo. And this is how the map of Africa turned out. Very different from the colourful map we saw earlier, with the new states and societies, dynamic new economic systems emerging, with the scramble for Africa, in many ways beginning in its early stages with people like Stanley, ending with people like Cecil Rhodes, and the straight lines, the demarcated spaces of the European colonial project in Africa. But we have to remind ourselves again that the meeting between Mutesa and Stanley in 1875 really does resonate in terms of ideas about co-option, not just conquest. Stanley believed he could co-opt Mutesa, Mutesa believed he could co-opt Stanley. And in many ways, the imperial project is as much about co-option as conquest. On the left here, we see the Uganda political order once it becomes a British protectorate. This young man here is Mutesa's grandson, Daudi Chwa, and he's surrounded by the pillars of the British and the Ugandan colonial establishment. And so in many ways, Uganda became an Afro-European political project. Much of the conquest was undertaken by African soldiers, as we see here in this picture in the centre. And ultimately, the colonial project was about a partnership in many ways, various types of pact between African rulers, in this case the King of Ashanti, and colonial governors, in this case the governor of the Gold Coast in West Africa. Ultimately, the story of how Stanley met Mutesa is a useful way of thinking about interaction, unequal relationships in some ways leading to European conquest, but also dynamics of co-option on both sides. And hopefully this taster lecture will have given you some indication of the various issues that we explore when we look at modern Africa.